David and Leo Johnson thought they knew their father. But when their mother, Leah, mysteriously disappears, the brothers are thrust into a twisted nightmare where nothing is as it seems. As whispers of betrayal and dark family secrets come to light, David discovers Leah's hidden journal, filled with cryptic warnings and a haunting revelation: if anything happened to her, it was because of their father. With the help of Kai, a friend entangled in their father's web of deceit, David must navigate a treacherous world of lies, blackmail, and violence. As they race against time to uncover the truth, they're forced to confront the dark shadow of the man who was supposed to protect them. But the closer they get to the truth, the more dangerous their lives become. In a desperate bid for justice, David will stop at nothing to protect Leo, even if it means facing the very man who tore their family apart. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. David's footsteps echoed in the silent house as he pushed the front door open, his younger brother, Leo, trailing behind him. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, the kind that prickled at the back of David's neck. The afternoon sun poured in through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. Something was wrong. "Mom? Dad?" David called out, but his voice was met with nothing but the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. Leo glanced up at him with worried eyes, clutching his backpack tighter. "Where is she?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. David didn't have an answer. Leah, their mother, was usually in the kitchen by this time, preparing dinner and humming a soft tune under her breath. But today, the house was deathly quiet. A chill ran down David's spine as he glanced at the overturned chair in the living room, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. "Stay here," David instructed Leo. He moved cautiously, stepping over the mess, his heart thumping louder with each step. The house felt like it had been ransacked, but there was no sign of forced entry. The kitchen was empty, the pots and pans still neatly in place. Leah's apron hung on its hook by the stove, untouched. "Mom!" David called again, louder this time, but it was useless. She was gone. The sound of glass breaking shattered the silence, causing both boys to jump. David turned toward the hallway, where the noise had come from. He could hear heavy footsteps approaching, uneven and stomping, like someone struggling to stay upright. John, their father, stumbled into view, reeking of alcohol. His eyes were bloodshot, his clothes disheveled, and a scowl twisted his usually stoic face. A beer bottle dangled precariously from his fingers, and David's stomach churned at the sight of him. "Where's Mom?" David demanded, stepping forward, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. John's lips curled into a cruel smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "She's gone," he slurred. "Left with her lover. Couldn't handle the life she chose. Coward." David's blood ran cold. The words felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "Leah, leave? Without saying goodbye? Without taking her sons with her?" It didn't make sense. He knew his mother better than that. "Liar!" Leo cried, tears streaming down his face. He rushed at their father, but David quickly pulled him back, holding him tightly. Leo trembled in his arms, sobbing against David's chest. John's eyes flickered with something dark as he glared at them both. "You think I'm lying, boy?" he growled, taking a threatening step closer. "You think your saint of a mother was so perfect? She was nothing but a—" "Shut up!" David shouted, his voice cracking. He couldn't let John spew more of his venom. The tension in the air was suffocating, and for a moment, David feared his father might strike him. But instead, John just laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that sent chills down David's spine. "You'll see for yourself," John muttered before turning away and disappearing down the hallway, leaving behind the stench of alcohol and the echo of his cruel words. David released Leo, who was still shaking with silent sobs. "It's okay," he whispered, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to reassure, Leo or himself. "We'll figure this out." As soon as John was out of sight, David's mind raced. Leah wouldn't have left them. Not like this. Something was terribly wrong. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. "Leo, go to your room and lock the door," David instructed, keeping his voice steady. "I need to check something." Leo hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, but he obeyed. As soon as Leo's door clicked shut, David hurried to his parents' bedroom. The room was a mess, with clothes strewn everywhere and the smell of whiskey lingering in the air. He rifled through drawers in the closet, searching for anything that might give him a clue. That's when he noticed it, a small, leather-bound journal half buried under a pile of clothes. It was Leah's handwriting on the cover. Heart pounding, David flipped it open to the last entry, written just a few days ago. "I'm scared of what John might do if he finds out what I know. I have to protect David and Leo. I'm running out of time. I can't let him control us anymore." David's hands shook as he read the words. What had his mother discovered? And why was she so afraid? His heart sank as he realized that whatever it was the reason she was gone. A crash from the hallway snapped him out of his thoughts. David quickly shoved the journal into his backpack and closed the drawer, just as John barged into the room. "What are you doing in here?" John demanded, his eyes narrowing as he looked around suspiciously. "Nothing," David replied, trying to sound casual. "Just looking for Mom's things." John's gaze lingered on him, and for a moment, David was sure his father knew he was lying. But then John just grunted and staggered out of the room, muttering under his breath. David let out a shaky breath, clutching his backpack tightly. Whatever his mother had been planning, he needed to find out. And he needed to protect Leo before it was too late. As he made his way back to his room, David's mind raced with questions. What did his mother know that made her so afraid of John? And what lengths would his father go to in order to keep it hidden? One thing was certain, Leah's disappearance was just the beginning. The secrets in their family were darker than David had ever imagined. The next morning, David awoke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. For a moment, he almost forgot the chaos of the previous day. But as he opened his eyes and saw the journal peeking out of his backpack, reality came crashing back. Leah was gone, and whatever happened to her was far from the story John had tried to spin. David sat up, rubbing his eyes. He had stayed up late the previous night, rereading Leah's final journal entries until exhaustion took over. The words were haunting, each line filled with fear and desperation. But the most troubling part was the last sentence she had written: "If anything happens to me, it's because of John." The thought of it sent a shiver down his spine. Leah had always been the one to protect them, to keep their family together despite John's drunken rages. If she had been scared enough to write something like that, then things were even worse than David had imagined. David's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at his bedroom door. He quickly shoved the journal under his mattress as Leo poked his head in. His younger brother looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "Hey," Leo said softly, stepping inside. "Did you find out anything?" David hesitated, not wanting to burden his little brother with everything he had discovered. Leo was only 14, too young to be dealing with the weight of their family's secrets. But David knew he couldn't lie to him either. Not now, when they only had each other. "I found Mom's journal," David whispered, glancing toward the door to make sure John wasn't lurking. "She was scared of Dad. She wrote that she thought he might do something to her." Leo's eyes widened in shock. "You mean, you think he—" "I don't know yet," David cut him off, not wanting to say the words out loud. "But we have to be careful, Leo. We can't trust him." Leo nodded, his face pale. "What do we do now?" David took a deep breath. We need to find out what Mom was planning. She must have had some kind of proof if she was willing to stand up to Dad. I'm going to look around the house today, see if I can find anything else she hid. But what if he catches you? Leo asked, his voice shaking. David put a reassuring hand on his brother's shoulder. Don't worry about me. Just stay out of his way, okay? I'll handle the rest. After sending Leo back to his room, David waited until he heard John leave the house, the front door slamming shut behind him. He listened carefully for the sound of the old truck's engine roaring to life, and only when it faded into the distance did he feel safe enough to move. David made his way to the kitchen, his heart pounding. Leah had always been meticulous about where she kept important things, bank statements, receipts, letters. If she had hidden something to expose John, it would be somewhere safe. Somewhere only she would think to look. He began by checking the cupboards, carefully moving cans and boxes aside, looking for any hidden compartments. But after half an hour of searching, he found nothing. Frustrated, David ran a hand through his hair, trying to think. There had to be something he was missing. Then, he remembered the old piano in the living room, the one Leah loved to play. It was the only thing she had brought with her when she married John, a relic from her childhood. David rushed over to it, lifting the lid and inspecting the inside. At first, it looked like just a normal piano, but then he noticed a loose panel at the back. Heart racing, David pried it open to reveal a small metal box wedged inside. It was locked, but he quickly found a bobby pin in Leah's sewing kit and managed to pick the lock after a few tries. The box creaked open, revealing a stack of letters and a small flash drive. David's hands trembled as he picked up the letters, scanning through them. They were addressed to Leah from a private investigator, detailing John's secret activities over the past few months. Affairs with multiple men, threats against people who got too close, and worse, mentions of Leah trying to gather evidence to protect her sons. But the flash drive was what caught David's attention the most. If Leah had gone through the trouble of hiding it, then it must contain something important. He quickly pulled out his laptop and inserted the drive, hoping it wasn't password protected. The screen flickered as the drive loaded, and a video file appeared. David clicked on it, holding his breath. The grainy footage showed Leah sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. If you're watching this, it means something happened to me, Leah's voice trembled as she spoke. John has been doing things. Terrible things. I tried to stop him, but I don't know if I can anymore. Please, whoever finds this, protect my boys. David's heart broke as he watched his mother's tearful confession. She had known she was in danger, and yet she stayed, hoping to protect him and Leo. But now she was gone, and it was up to him to finish what she started. A loud crash echoed from the front door, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. David's blood ran cold. John was back, and if he caught David with the flash drive, there was no telling what he would do. Panicking, David yanked the drive from the laptop and shoved it into his pocket. He quickly hid the metal box back inside the piano and ran up the stairs to his room, praying that John hadn't noticed him in the living room. The door to his room had barely closed behind him when John's booming voice echoed through the house. David! Where are you? David's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. Clutching the flash drive in his fist, he steeled himself. He had the proof Leah had died for. Now, he just had to figure out what to do with it before it was too late. David's heart was still racing hours after John's angry voice had echoed through the house. He sat on his bed, the room illuminated only by the faint light of his laptop screen. The flash drive Leah had hidden was now his most valuable possession, but it was also the most dangerous. If John found out he had it, there would be hell to pay. David replayed the video file Leah had recorded, her fearful eyes burning into his memory. John has been doing things. Terrible things, she had said. What could be so terrible that it drove his mother to hide evidence and leave a cryptic warning behind? David's mind swirled with possibilities, each darker than the last. His door creaked open slowly, and David quickly shut his laptop, the glow vanishing in an instant. It was Leo, looking pale and anxious. "Is Dad asleep?" David whispered. Leo nodded. "Yeah, he passed out on the couch. I think he drank too much again." David let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. That would buy him some time. "Good. Listen, Leo," he said, lowering his voice even further, "I found something on Mom's flash drive. But we have to be careful. If Dad finds out." "What did you find?" Leo asked, eyes wide with worry. It's a recording. Mom was afraid of something Dad was doing. She didn't trust him." David hesitated, not wanting to frighten his brother, but knowing he couldn't hide the truth forever. "I think she was planning to expose him." Leo's face drained of color. You think Dad did something to her? That he hurt her?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on Leo's shoulder. "I don't know for sure yet," he admitted. "But I promise you, I'm going to find out." A loud crash echoed from downstairs, followed by the muffled sound of John cursing. Both brothers froze, their eyes wide with fear. John must have woken up. David's mind raced. If their father found them whispering together like this, he'd know something was up. "Go back to your room," David urged Leo in a hushed tone. "I'll handle it." Leo nodded reluctantly and slipped out of the room. David waited until he heard his brother's door close before he stood up, every nerve in his body on high alert. He needed to figure out a plan, fast. The information on the flash drive was a ticking time bomb, and it was only a matter of time before John noticed something was off. Trying to stay calm, David made his way to the living room. He needed to see if John was still awake. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he could hear his father's drunken muttering. John was slumped on the couch, the remnants of a whiskey bottle dangling from his fingers. David kept his distance, hoping to slip by unnoticed, but John's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot and wild. "David," he barked. "What the hell are you doing sneaking around?" David's pulse quickened. He forced a casual tone, hoping to defuse the situation. "Just getting a glass of water," he lied, nodding toward the kitchen. "Couldn't sleep." John's gaze lingered on him, suspicion flickering in his eyes. For a moment, David thought he would call him out, but instead, John let out a harsh laugh. "You're just like your mother," he sneered. "Always poking your nose where it doesn't belong." David's jaw clenched, but he bit back a retort. He couldn't afford to provoke his father, not when so much was at stake. He nodded silently and turned toward the kitchen, hoping the conversation was over. But as he walked away, John's voice followed him, low and menacing. "Don't think I don't know what you're up to," John muttered. "Your mother thought she was so clever, too. Look where that got her." David's blood ran cold, but he kept walking, refusing to give his father the satisfaction of seeing his fear. Once he was out of John's line of sight, he let out a shaky breath. It was getting worse. John's paranoia was growing, and it was only a matter of time before he turned that suspicion into violence. David grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen, more to steady his nerves than out of thirst. As he drank, his mind raced. He needed to talk to someone who knew what to do with the kind of evidence Leah had gathered. But who could he trust? The town was small, and news traveled fast. If anyone found out what he had, it could put both him and Leo in danger. Then he thought of Kai. Leo's friend might be the last person David wanted to trust, especially after what he had witnessed between Kai and John, but he also knew Kai had secrets of his own. If anyone could help him figure out what to do next, it might be him. Determined, David slipped back upstairs to his room. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Kai's number. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he was making a mistake. But with everything he had uncovered, he was running out of options. He sent a quick text, "I need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me tomorrow at the old park after school. Don't tell anyone." David lay back on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Every day brought him closer to the truth, but it also brought him closer to danger. He only hoped that whatever Kai was hiding, it would be enough to help him figure out what really happened to Leah, before John discovered the secrets David was trying so desperately to uncover. As he drifted off to sleep, the weight of his mother's final words echoed in his mind. "If anything happens to me, it's because of John." The truth was out there, somewhere in the shadows. David just had to find it before it was too late. David's heart raced as he approached the old park after school the next day. It was a forgotten corner of town, overgrown and abandoned, a relic of a happier time before the Johnson family's life had spiraled into chaos. The worn-out swings creaked in the wind, and the rusted merry-go-round squeaked with each gust, creating an eerie soundtrack to David's mounting anxiety. He spotted Kai leaning against a graffitied wall, the collar of his jacket pulled up to shield his face from the November chill. As David approached, Kai glanced around nervously, his eyes darting like a hunted animal's. It was clear he was just as anxious about this meeting as David was. "You came," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. Kai nodded, his expression guarded. "You said it was urgent. What's going on?" David took a deep breath, trying to figure out where to start. He wasn't sure he could trust Kai, especially after discovering the disturbing connection between him and John. But right now, he had no one else to turn to. "I found something," David said, lowering his voice. "Something about my mom, and your relationship with my father." Kai flinched, his eyes widening. For a moment, it looked like he was going to bolt, but he stayed rooted in place, clenching his fists. "What do you mean?" Kai whispered, his voice barely audible. David pulled out the flash drive from his pocket and held it up. "This," he said. "My mom recorded a video before she disappeared. She was trying to expose something about my dad. She mentioned you." Kai's face went pale, and he looked away, biting his lip. David could see the fear in his eyes. "Why did you drag me into this?" Kai hissed. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." David stepped closer, his voice rising in frustration. "Then tell me. What the hell is going on between you and my father? Why was my mom so scared?" Kai let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand," he muttered. "If your dad finds out that I'm talking to you, he'll destroy me." David's mind was spinning. It was clear that whatever hold John had over Kai was stronger than he had imagined. But he needed answers, and he needed them now. "What is he threatening you with?" David pressed, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I know he's been blackmailing you." For a moment, Kai seemed on the verge of breaking down, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But then, he clenched his jaw and shook his head. "It doesn't matter. I'm already in too deep." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Kai, please," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "If you know something about my mom, you have to tell me. I need to know the truth." Kai's resolve wavered, and he finally met David's eyes. "Fine," he said in a harsh whisper. "I'll tell you what I know, but if this gets back to your dad, we're both dead. Do you understand?" David nodded, his heart pounding. "I understand. Just tell me." Kai glanced around again, making sure they were still alone. "Your mom, she found out about me and your dad," he began, his voice shaky. She threatened to expose him, to ruin his reputation in the town. But she didn't know the whole story. What story? David demanded, leaning in closer. Kai hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of what he was about to reveal. Your dad, he's been using me, Kai confessed, his voice barely more than a whisper. I was stupid enough to get involved with him, and when I tried to back out, he threatened to expose me. I'm not out to my family. If they found out. David's anger flared, but he tried to keep it in check. So, my father's been using that to control you? David's voice shook with disbelief. Kai nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. It's worse than that, he said. Your mom found out about us. She came to me, told me she had proof, but before she could go public, she disappeared. David's blood ran cold. So it was true. John had something to do with Leah's disappearance, and Kai was somehow caught in the crossfire. Why didn't you say anything? David asked, his voice filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. Kai wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I was scared, David. Your dad, he's powerful. He has connections. If he found out I was talking to you, he wouldn't just ruin me, he'd hurt everyone I care about. David's mind was racing. His mother's disappearance, the threats, the blackmail, it was all starting to make sense. But there was still so much he didn't know. Do you have any proof? David asked, his voice urgent. Anything we can use against him? Kai shook his head. No. Your mom, she had everything. I don't know where she kept it. All I know is that she was planning to meet with someone in town, someone who could help her take your dad down. David's heart sank. His mother had been so close to exposing the truth, but she'd been silenced before she could. Now it was up to him to finish what she had started. But he couldn't do it alone. Will you help me? David asked, his eyes searching Kai's for any sign of betrayal. Please, Kai. I need to find out what happened to her. Kai hesitated for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I'll help you, he said. But we have to be careful. If your dad finds out. I know, David said grimly. We won't let him. As they parted ways, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous things were becoming. But now, with Kai on his side, he finally had an ally. Together, they would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. David watched Kai disappear into the shadows, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. Whatever secrets his father was hiding, they were darker and more twisted than he could have ever imagined. But one thing was certain, he wouldn't stop until he found out what really happened to Leah. As David turned to leave the park, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing there, just the rustling leaves and the creaking swings. Shivering, he quickened his pace, determined to get home before John realized he had been out. The game had changed. And now, it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The wind whipped through the bare branches outside as David hurried back home from the park. His mind raced with everything Kai had revealed. It was almost too much to process, the blackmail, the threats, the secret affair between Kai and John. But what haunted him most was that his mother had known the truth and paid the ultimate price for it. As David approached the house, he spotted Leo sitting on the porch, his knees pulled up to his chest. His brother looked like a small, frightened child in the dimming twilight, his face pale and eyes red from crying. David's heart twisted with guilt. He hadn't told Leo everything yet. How could he, when the truth was so dark? Hey, David called softly as he walked up the steps. Leo looked up, his eyes filled with questions. What's wrong? Did something happen? Leo shook his head but didn't meet David's gaze. I've been thinking, he mumbled. About what you said, about Mom. And Dad. David hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Leo was only 14, after all. But he also knew they couldn't afford secrets anymore. Not with everything that was at stake. Leo, listen, David said, sitting down beside him. I found more proof. Mom didn't just leave us. She was trying to protect us, and Dad, he's involved in something bad. Leo's eyes widened, and for a moment, David saw fear flash across his brother's face. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by something darker. Why can't you just drop this, David? Leo snapped, his voice shaking. Dad said you're just trying to stir up trouble, that you're the one making things worse. David's heart sank. Of course John had already started poisoning Leo's mind. I know it's hard to believe, David said, keeping his voice calm. But I have evidence. Mom recorded a video before she disappeared, warning us about Dad. Leo stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. You're lying. You're just trying to turn me against him. He was shouting now, his voice breaking. I saw how you've been sneaking around, talking to people behind our backs. Dad told me you're just trying to destroy our family. David's frustration boiled over. Leo, you have to wake up. Dad's been lying to you, to both of us. I found Mom's journal, I've seen the proof. He's the one who's tearing this family apart, not me. But Leo wasn't listening. He turned and stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind him. David stared after him, his heart heavy with despair. He had hoped Leo would understand, that he would stand by him as they tried to uncover the truth. But John's influence over his brother was stronger than he had realized. Taking a deep breath, David followed Leo inside. The house was dimly lit, shadows clinging to the walls like dark secrets. As David made his way to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of everything he had discovered. He needed more proof, something concrete that would convince Leo once and for all. Sitting on his bed, he pulled Leah's journal from its hiding place beneath his mattress. There had to be something he missed, some clue that would make Leo see the truth. David flipped through the pages, scanning Leah's shaky handwriting. Most of the entries were filled with fear, detailing John's increasingly erratic behavior. But one entry, in particular, caught his eye. I'm running out of time. John has been meeting with someone in secret. I don't know who, but it's getting worse. If I disappear, it won't be because I ran away. It will be because he found out what I know. David's blood ran cold. His mother had known something far more sinister than just John's affairs. What could have driven her to the point of leaving behind a video confession and hiding evidence in their own home? Before he could dwell on it further, the sound of shattering glass echoed from downstairs, followed by John's furious bellow. David's stomach twisted. He knew that sound all too well, it meant his father was drunk and angry. David stuffed the journal back under his mattress and rushed downstairs. The scene that greeted him was one of chaos. A broken bottle lay in pieces on the floor, and John was looming over Leo, his face twisted with rage. What did I tell you about snooping around, huh? John growled, his voice slurred and dangerous. Leo was trembling, tears streaming down his face, too terrified to speak. David's protective instincts kicked in. Hey! Leave him alone, he shouted, stepping between his father and Leo. John turned his bloodshot eyes on David, his expression darkening. Oh, look who's come to play the hero, he sneered. Think you can protect him, huh? Just like your mother thought she could protect you? David's fists clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. Leave Leo out of this. If you have a problem, take it up with me. John laughed, the sound hollow and cold. You think you're so smart, don't you? Digging around, trying to find something that isn't there. Your mother was the same way, always poking her nose where it didn't belong. Where is she, Dad? David demanded, his voice shaking with fury. What did you do to her? For a moment, John's face twisted with something almost like fear, but then it was gone, replaced with his usual sneer. You think you can handle the truth, he spat. You're just a kid. You have no idea what's going on. Before David could respond, John lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Stay out of my business, he hissed, his breath reeking of alcohol. If you know what's good for you, you'll forget about your mother. She's gone, and that's all you need to know. David's vision blurred as John's grip tightened, but he refused to back down. I'm not afraid of you, he managed to choke out. I'll find out what you did. And when I do, I'll make sure everyone knows. John released him with a shove, sending David sprawling to the floor. You're playing a dangerous game, boy, John growled. But if you want to end up like your mother, be my guest. David watched as John stumbled back toward the living room, leaving him and Leo in a terrified silence. David struggled to his feet, bruises already forming on his neck. He glanced at Leo, who was staring at him with a mix of fear and awe. David. Leo whispered, his voice trembling. What do we do now? David's resolve hardened. We find the proof we need, he said quietly. We bring him down. For Mom. David couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's rage-filled face and heard his mother's desperate warning in her journal. The house felt like a ticking time bomb, and David knew he had to act quickly if he wanted to uncover the truth before John did something even more drastic. By dawn, David had made up his mind. He needed help, and there was only one person who might know more, Kai. David sent a quick text to Kai before leaving the house, making sure to sneak out quietly so John wouldn't hear him. I need to see you again. Meet me behind the old library ASAP. The sun was just beginning to rise as David hurried through the empty streets. The town was still asleep, unaware of the secrets brewing beneath its surface. By the time he reached the back of the library, Kai was already waiting for him, leaning against the brick wall with his hands shoved into his pockets. You said it was urgent, Kai muttered, glancing around nervously. What's going on? David pulled Leah's journal from his backpack, flipping it open to the last few entries. I found more in my mom's journal, he said, keeping his voice low. She knew about you and my dad, but that's not all. She was planning to meet someone who could help her take him down. Kai's eyes widened as he scanned the pages, his expression growing more troubled with each sentence. She knew more than I thought, he whispered, almost to himself. I thought she was just trying to scare him into stopping. David watched Kai's face closely, searching for any sign that he might be hiding something. What do you know about this? David asked. Who was she meeting with? What else did she find out? Kai hesitated, clearly torn. I don't know exactly, he admitted. But I heard your dad talking about her meeting someone. He was furious. That's when things got really bad. David's pulse quickened. What do you mean, really bad? Kai looked away, his jaw clenched. Your dad, he said he'd do whatever it took to protect himself. That if she tried to expose him, she wouldn't live to see it happen. David's heart sank. His mother had known the risks, and she had still tried to protect them. But she hadn't counted on just how far John was willing to go. Do you think he? David couldn't finish the question, but Kai understood. Kai nodded slowly. I'm almost certain. But without proof, there's nothing we can do. David's hands trembled as he flipped through the journal, searching for any more clues. There has to be something we can use, he muttered. Something that can expose him once and for all. Kai reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "Your mom gave this to me a few days before she disappeared," he said, handing it to David. "She told me to keep it safe, in case anything happened to her." David unfolded the paper to find a list of names, dates, and locations. At the bottom, Leah had scrawled a single sentence: "Meet with him, H. on November 3rd. He knows everything." David's eyes widened. "Who's M.H.?" he asked, his mind racing. This could be the key to everything. Kai shook his head. "I don't know. But your dad was hell-bent on finding out. He tore through the house looking for anything she might have left behind." David stuffed the paper into his backpack, a newfound determination surging through him. "We need to find out who this M.H. is," he said. "If he has the information my mom was after, he might be able to help us." But before they could plan their next move, the sound of heavy footsteps approached. David's blood ran cold. He recognized that gait. It was John. Without thinking, David grabbed Kai's arm and pulled him into the shadows behind a dumpster. They held their breath as John's figure came into view, his eyes scanning the area. For a moment, David thought he'd been spotted, but then John turned and stormed off, cursing under his breath. "That was close," Kai whispered, his voice shaking. "What's he doing here?" David's mind raced. "He must have followed me. He knows we're getting close." Kai's face paled. "David, if he finds out what we're planning, he won't just threaten you. He'll—" "I know," David interrupted, his voice grim. "But I'm not backing down. Not now." As soon as the coast was clear, they slipped out of their hiding spot and made their way back to Kai's apartment. It was small and cramped, but it was safe, at least for now. Kai locked the door behind them, and they both collapsed onto the worn-out couch, their adrenaline slowly ebbing away. David pulled out the flash drive he'd found earlier, the one Leah had hidden in the piano. "There's more on this drive," he said. "Mom must have hidden something that can expose him." Kai looked at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "If it's enough to take him down, we have to get it to someone who can help us." David nodded, plugging the drive into Kai's laptop. The files were encrypted, but David had found a password scribbled in the back of Leah's journal. Holding his breath, he typed it in. The screen flickered for a moment before revealing a folder filled with documents and video files. "Holy shit," Kai whispered as they opened the first file. It was a series of emails between John and someone named M.H. discussing payments, threats, and cover-ups. But the real shock came when they played the video file. It was a grainy recording, but the audio was clear. It was a conversation between Leah and a man whose face was partially obscured. "You need to be careful, Leah," the man was saying. "If John finds out you're planning to expose him, he won't let you live." Leah's voice was shaky but determined. "I have to do this. For my boys. They deserve to know the truth." David's eyes burned with unshed tears as he watched his mother's courage play out on the screen. She had risked everything to protect him and Leo, and now it was up to him to finish what she started. "We need to get this to the police," Kai said, his voice urgent. "This is enough to put him away for good." David hesitated, knowing the danger. "We can't just walk into the police station with this," he said. "John has connections everywhere. We need to find this M.H. first. He's the key to all of this." Kai nodded. "Then we'd better move fast. If John finds out what we have..." David's jaw tightened. "We won't give him the chance." As they prepared to leave, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But he pushed it aside, knowing that every second they wasted brought them closer to danger. The clock was ticking, and now it was a race against time to find M.H. before John closed in on them. David's heart pounded as he hurried back home from Kai's apartment. The weight of the flash drive in his pocket felt heavier with each step. It was as if the proof Leah had risked everything to gather was burning a hole through his jacket, and with it, the truth was finally within reach. But David also knew that every second he had it in his possession was a second closer to disaster. As he approached the house, he spotted Leo pacing on the porch, his arms wrapped around himself against the evening chill. David felt a pang of guilt. He had left his younger brother in the dark for too long, and now, with everything unraveling, he couldn't afford to hide the truth any longer. "Leo," David called softly as he climbed the steps. Leo turned, his eyes filled with confusion and hurt. "Where have you been?" Leo demanded. "Dad's been asking for you all day. He thinks you're trying to do something behind his back." David let out a frustrated sigh. "I can't explain everything right now," he said, glancing nervously at the front door. "But I need you to trust me, okay? I found something that can finally prove what Dad's been hiding." Leo's face twisted with disbelief. "You're still on about that?" "David, Dad said you're just trying to mess with our heads. He told me you're the reason Mom left." The accusation hit David like a punch to the gut. He hadn't realized just how deeply John's lies had taken root in Leo's mind. "You really believe that?" David asked, his voice breaking. "After everything I've told you, after all the times he's hurt us?" Leo's expression wavered, but he shook his head, tears pooling in his eyes. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he whispered. "I just want things to go back to how they were, before all this." David stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, I get it. You're scared. I'm scared too. But I found evidence, Leo. I found proof that he might have done something terrible to Mom. She was trying to protect us." Leo's eyes widened, and for a moment, David thought he might have finally broken through the wall of denial. But then, Leo's expression hardened. "If you really had proof, why haven't you gone to the police?" he challenged. "Why are you sneaking around like you're the one with something to hide?" David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could explain, the front door swung open with a crash. John stood in the doorway, his face a mask of barely contained fury. "What the hell is going on out here?" John growled, his gaze flicking between his sons. His eyes were bloodshot, and the stench of whiskey filled the air around him. "What lies has your brother been filling your head with now, Leo?" David stepped in front of Leo protectively, his heart racing. "I'm not the one lying here, Dad," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I found Mom's journal. I know what you did. And I have proof." John's eyes narrowed, and his expression twisted into a sneer. "You think a few scribbles in some notebook and a couple of files are going to save you?" he taunted. "You don't know who you're dealing with, boy." Leo's gaze darted between his father and brother, panic etched across his features. "Dad." "David, what's going on?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What did you find?" David turned to Leo, desperately hoping his brother would finally listen. "Mom was trying to expose Dad," he said. "She found out about his affairs, about the people he's been blackmailing. That's why she disappeared." "Shut up!" John roared, stepping forward and grabbing David by the collar. "You have no idea what you're talking about." David struggled against his father's grip, his mind racing. He couldn't afford to let John intimidate him now. "You killed her, didn't you?" David spat. "She was going to expose you, so you got rid of her." John's face contorted with rage, and for a terrifying moment, David thought his father might actually strike him. But instead, John shoved him hard, sending him sprawling onto the porch floor. "You ungrateful little shit," John hissed. "Everything I did to protect this family." David's head spun as he scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his ears. "You didn't protect anyone," he shot back. "You destroyed us." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Leo stood frozen, tears streaming down his cheeks, as if he couldn't process what was happening. "Is it true, Dad?" Leo asked in a broken whisper. Did you hurt Mom?" John's eyes flickered with something that looked almost like regret, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Your mother was a fool," he muttered. "She thought she could take me down, but she didn't understand the world she was playing in." David's blood ran cold at his father's words. This was the closest John had come to admitting the truth, but it still wasn't enough. "You're not going to get away with this," David said, his voice steady now. "I have the proof, and I'm going to find someone who can stop you." John's eyes narrowed. "You think you can outsmart me? You have no idea how deep this goes." He turned to Leo, his voice softening, but it was a sickly sweet tone. "Leo, you don't have to listen to him. He's just trying to tear us apart. We're a family." Leo looked torn, his gaze flickering between his father and brother. But David could see the fear in his eyes, the way his hands trembled. "You're lying," Leo finally whispered, his voice barely audible. David wouldn't lie about something like this. John's face darkened. "Fine," he spat, turning back to David. "You want a war? Then that's what you'll get. But you'd better be ready to lose everything." Without another word, John turned and stormed back into the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the night, leaving David and Leo standing alone on the porch, shaken to their core. David turned to Leo, who was staring at him with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Leo, we need to get out of here," David said urgently. "We need to find the person Mom was trying to meet with. It's the only way to stop him." Leo nodded slowly, wiping away his tears. "Okay," he said, his voice shaky but determined. "I'll help you." For the first time, David felt a glimmer of hope. With Leo finally on his side, they had a chance. But he knew their time was running out. John wasn't going to let them go without a fight. As they hurried back inside to pack their bags, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The truth was out there, but they would have to fight tooth and nail to uncover it, and survive. David's hands shook as he stuffed clothes and essentials into a backpack, his mind racing with a million thoughts. He could hear Leo moving quickly in the room next to his, the sound of zippers and rustling fabric a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of David's heart. They needed to move fast, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins kept him from collapsing under the weight of what had just happened. David had barely zipped up his bag when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Kai. "Are you okay? I heard shouting when I passed your house. Meet me at the old factory." David glanced out the window to make sure John wasn't lurking outside. The house was eerily quiet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his father was waiting, watching, ready to strike the moment they let their guard down. He texted back quickly, "On our way. Be careful." Turning back to his brother, who was standing in the doorway with wide, fearful eyes, David gave a reassuring nod. "We're going to meet Kai," he said. "We can trust him. He's on our side." Leo hesitated but finally nodded, clutching his backpack tightly. "I'm scared, David," he whispered. "What if Dad finds us?" David placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, trying to steady him. "We're going to be okay," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "We have everything we need to stop him. But we have to act fast." They slipped out the back door, staying low and moving quickly through the shadows. The old factory where they were meeting Kai was a relic from another era, abandoned, decaying, and forgotten. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting. David kept looking over his shoulder, half expecting John to appear at any moment, but they reached the factory without incident. As they approached, David saw Kai pacing near the entrance, his face drawn with worry. When he saw David and Leo, he let out a breath of relief. "Thank God," Kai muttered, rushing forward. I was worried he'd already gotten to you. David shook his head. We're okay, for now. But he's getting desperate. We don't have much time. Kai nodded, his expression grim. I found something that might help, he said, pulling out a small, worn notebook from his jacket. These are more notes your mom gave me. I didn't understand what they meant at first, but now. David's eyes widened as he flipped through the pages. The notes were filled with cryptic messages, names, and addresses. But one entry stood out: M.H. will have the evidence. He's the key. Leo peered over David's shoulder. Who's M.H.? he asked, his voice trembling. I don't know, David replied, frustration bubbling up. But whoever he is, he knows something that can take down Dad. Kai pointed to one of the addresses scrawled in the notebook. This place isn't far from here. It's a rundown motel on the edge of town. If M.H. is still there, he might have the information your mom was trying to get. David nodded. Then that's where we're going, he said firmly. If we can find this M.H., we can finally expose Dad. But before they could move, Leo grabbed David's arm, panic in his eyes. What if it's a trap? Leo whispered. What if Dad already knows we're going there? David's heart skipped a beat. It was a real possibility, but they didn't have any other options. We have to take that risk, he said, his voice steady. It's the only lead we have. Kai looked around nervously. We should split up, he suggested. If we go together, we'll be too easy to spot. I'll go to the motel first and see if it's safe. If I don't come back in 30 minutes, you'll know something's wrong. David hesitated, not wanting to send Kai into danger alone. But Kai was right, they couldn't afford to be reckless. Okay, David agreed reluctantly. We'll wait for your signal. But be careful. Kai gave a tight nod before disappearing into the shadows, leaving David and Leo to wait in the crumbling remains of the factory. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. David kept glancing at his watch, his anxiety growing with each passing second. What if something happened to him? Leo asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. David shook his head, refusing to entertain that thought. He'll be okay, he said, though the words felt hollow. We just have to trust him. 20 minutes turned into 25, and David was on the verge of going after Kai when a faint rustle came from the entrance. David tensed, ready to bolt if it was John. But it was Kai, panting and out of breath. There's someone there, Kai gasped, his eyes wide with fear. I couldn't see his face, but he had a gun. He was asking about Leah. David's blood ran cold. This was worse than he'd imagined. Was it Dad? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Kai shook his head. I don't think so. He was too young, but he knew about your mom. I think he's working for your dad. David's mind raced. If John had sent someone to intercept them, then M.H. was in danger, and so were they. We have to get to that motel, David said, his voice filled with urgency. If M.H. knows something, we need to get to him before they do. Leo's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. Okay, he whispered. Let's go. The three of them moved quickly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the back streets. The town felt like a ghost town, every corner hiding potential danger. David kept a tight grip on his backpack, the flash drive inside their last hope of exposing John. As they approached the rundown motel, they spotted a black car parked outside. David's stomach twisted with dread. That has to be one of Dad's guys, he whispered. We need to be careful. They crept closer, using the broken walls and overgrown bushes as cover. Through a dirty window, David spotted a man inside one of the rooms, pacing angrily. In his hand was a folder, and David's heart skipped a beat when he saw Leah's handwriting on it. "That's it," David whispered to Kai and Leo. "That's the proof we need." But before they could move, the man turned toward the door, his gun gleaming in the dim light. David's breath caught in his throat. They were running out of time. David turned to Kai and Leo, his voice barely audible. "We're going to have to take a risk," he said. "If we don't get that folder, everything Mom did will be for nothing." Kai nodded, determination hardening his features. "Let's do this," he said. Together, they moved into position, ready to face whatever came next. David's heart pounded as he prepared to make his move, knowing that this was their last chance to bring John down. If they failed, it would all be over. But failure was not an option. David's breath came in shallow gasps as he crouched behind the overgrown bushes, his eyes fixed on the shadowy figure inside the rundown motel room. The man continued to pace back and forth, occasionally glancing at the folder in his hand, the folder that David was certain held the proof Leah had risked everything to obtain. Beside him, Leo clutched his arm, trembling. David gave his younger brother's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, though he couldn't shake the knot of fear tightening in his own stomach. Kai, on his other side, was watching the scene unfold with steely determination. "We need to move fast," David whispered. "If that guy is working for Dad, he's not going to let go of that folder easily." Kai nodded, his jaw set. "I'll create a distraction," he said. "You two sneak in through the back. I'll draw him out." David hesitated, worry gnawing at him. Kai had already risked so much to help them. But before he could argue, Kai was already slipping away, his figure blending into the shadows. David turned to Leo, who was pale but resolute. "Are you ready?" David asked. Leo swallowed hard but nodded. "Let's do this." They waited, hearts pounding, as Kai made his way around to the front of the motel. A moment later, the sound of a loud crash echoed through the night, followed by a string of angry curses from inside the room. David took that as his cue. "Now," he hissed, and he and Leo sprinted toward the back entrance of the motel. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as David pushed it open. The smell of mildew and decay hit them like a wall, but they pressed on, the sound of the scuffle outside spurring them forward. As they crept down the dim hallway, David's heart pounded louder with each step. The door to the room with the mysterious man was just ahead. David could hear the man barking orders into a phone. "No, I don't care what it takes. Just find the boys and bring them to me." David exchanged a worried glance with Leo. Whoever this man was, he was clearly after them on John's orders. David clenched his fists. They had to get that folder and get out before it was too late. David took a deep breath, nodded to Leo, and then kicked the door open with a loud bang. The man spun around, shock written on his face, but he recovered quickly, reaching for his gun. "Stay back," the man snarled, aiming the gun at them. But his hands were shaking, and David could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "We don't want any trouble," David said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "We just want that folder." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just waltz in here and take it? You have no idea who you're dealing with." David's mind raced. He needed to stall him, buy Kai enough time to circle back and help them. "We know exactly who we're dealing with," David shot back. "John sent you, didn't he? To cover up everything he's done." For a moment, the man's expression faltered, and David took a step forward, hoping to keep him talking. "You don't have to do this," David said. "Whatever my father's paying you, it's not worth it." The man's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, the door behind him burst open. Kai lunged into the room, tackling the man to the ground. The gun went off, the deafening sound echoing in the confined space. Leo screamed, and David's heart nearly stopped. "Leo!" David cried, but his brother was unhurt, pressed flat against the wall. The shot had gone wide, embedding itself into the ceiling. "Grab the folder!" Kai yelled, struggling to pin the man down. David snapped into action, rushing to the table where the folder lay. He snatched it up, stuffing it into his backpack just as the man threw Kai off with a grunt. "Run!" David shouted. Leo didn't need to be told twice. The brothers bolted for the door, with Kai right behind them. They sprinted down the dark hallway, the man's furious shouts echoing behind them. As they burst out into the night, David's lungs burned with each gasp of cold air. He could hear the man giving chase, his footsteps pounding behind them. But they were faster, fueled by fear and the desperate need to escape. They rounded a corner and slipped into a narrow alleyway, pressing themselves against the wall, hoping the darkness would hide them. David's heart felt like it was about to burst out of his chest as the footsteps grew louder, then faded as the man ran past their hiding spot. For a moment, the only sound was their heavy breathing. David turned to Kai, who was clutching his side where the man had landed a solid punch. "Are you okay?" David asked. "I'm fine," Kai panted. "But we need to get out of here before he comes back." David nodded, peeking around the corner to make sure the coast was clear. "Let's go," he whispered. "We need to find somewhere safe to look through this folder." They made their way through the maze of backstreets, finally stopping at an abandoned shed on the outskirts of town. It was small and barely standing, but it would have to do. David set down his backpack and pulled out the folder, his hands shaking. Leo hovered over his shoulder, his eyes wide with fear and anticipation. "What's in it?" he asked. David flipped it open, revealing pages of documents, photographs, and typed letters. At the top of one page was the name MH followed by a series of bank transactions. But the most damning piece was a letter signed by John himself, detailing payments and threats to silence anyone who might expose him. "Oh my God," Kai breathed, staring at the evidence. "This is it, David. This is everything we need." David nodded, tears pricking at his eyes. Leah had gathered all of this to protect them, and now, finally, they had what they needed to bring John down. But as he turned the pages, his heart sank when he saw a recent date, November 10th, final payment due. "Eliminate all threats." "That's today," David whispered, his voice hollow. "He's planning to get rid of us tonight." Kai's eyes widened in horror. "We have to go to the police now," he urged. "There's no time to waste." David nodded, his resolve hardening. "We're not running anymore. We're taking this to the police. Tonight." As they gathered their things, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. But with the folder in his hands, they finally had the leverage they needed to stop John. The clock was ticking, but for the first time, David felt a spark of hope. This was their chance. They were going to end it, or die trying. David's heart pounded as he, Leo, and Kai raced down the dark, empty streets. The folder full of incriminating evidence against John was clutched tightly in David's hands. They had everything they needed to bring him down, but they were running out of time. If John's plan was to silence them tonight, they had to act fast. The town was eerily quiet as they sprinted toward the police station. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows, making every corner seem like a potential hiding spot for one of John's men. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every sound, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant bark of a dog, sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. "We're almost there," Kai panted, glancing over his shoulder. "Just a few more blocks." David nodded, but he could see the fear in Leo's eyes. His younger brother was barely holding it together. David had to stay strong for him, even if he felt like he was about to collapse from exhaustion and fear. "Hang in there, Leo," David said, reaching out to squeeze his brother's shoulder. "We're going to make it." But just as the glowing sign of the police station came into view, the screech of tires cut through the night. A black car skidded around the corner, its headlights blinding as it bore down on them. David's heart lurched. It was one of John's men. "Run!" David shouted, pushing Leo forward. They darted into a narrow alleyway, the car screeching to a halt behind them. The sound of footsteps pounding against the pavement grew louder. David's mind raced. They needed to lose their pursuers, but they couldn't afford to waste time. They had to get to the police station. Kai skidded to a stop beside a metal dumpster, yanking it down to block the alleyway behind them. "This way," he called, leading them through a maze of narrow passages. David didn't know how Kai knew these back routes, but he didn't have time to question it. They burst out onto another street, gasping for breath. The police station was just across the road, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow. Relief flooded David's chest, but it was short-lived. The roar of an engine behind them signaled that the car had found them again. "Go!" David yelled, shoving Leo and Kai forward. "I'll hold them off." "No!" Leo cried, grabbing David's arm. "I'm not leaving you." David turned to his brother, his eyes blazing with determination. "You have to, Leo. You need to get that folder to the police. It's the only way we can stop him." Kai pulled Leo away, his grip firm. "He's right, Leo. We need to move." David watched as they sprinted toward the police station. The car roared closer, and David turned to face it, his heart thundering in his chest. As it skidded to a stop, a large man stepped out, gun in hand. David's mind went blank with terror, but he stood his ground. "Where do you think you're going, kid?" The man sneered, aiming the gun at David's chest. "Your daddy wants a word." David's hands clenched into fists, but before he could respond, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The man's eyes widened, and he glanced back at the car. "Damn it," he muttered. "This isn't over." He lunged at David, but David dodged, adrenaline giving him strength. The man stumbled, and in that split second, David bolted toward the police station. The sirens were getting closer, and he prayed that Leo and Kai had made it inside. David burst through the doors of the station, gasping for breath. The front desk officer looked up in surprise. "Help!" David cried. "I have evidence, my father, he's trying to kill us." The officer's eyes widened, and he immediately reached for his radio. "We've got a situation here," he shouted. "Get the chief." David turned to see Kai and Leo standing at the far end of the room, surrounded by officers. Relief washed over him as he rushed to join them. "Did you give them the folder?" he asked, his voice shaking. Kai nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "They're looking through it now." "We did it, David. We got it to them." But just as hope began to bloom in David's chest, the door to the station slammed open, and John strode in, flanked by two men in suits. His face was a mask of fury, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "David," John said, his voice deceptively calm. "What are you doing here, son? You're making a big mistake." David's blood turned to ice, but he stood his ground. "It's over, Dad," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. "We have proof of everything you've done. The police have it now." John's eyes flickered to the officers gathered around them, but his smile didn't falter. "Oh, David," he said softly. "You really think these men will help you? I own half this town." David's heart sank as he realized the truth in John's words. The officers who had been so eager to help moments ago now looked uncertain, casting nervous glances at John. But before David could react, the door to the back office burst open, and a tall, stern-looking man in uniform stepped out. "Chief Matthews," one of the officers said with relief. "We have evidence that." "Hand it over," Chief Matthews ordered, cutting him off. He turned to David, his eyes hard. "If what you're saying is true, I'll make sure it's handled properly." David hesitated, fear and hope warring within him. But then Leo stepped forward, holding out the folder. "Please, sir," Leo said, his voice trembling. "This is everything. Our mom, she tried to expose him, and he hurt her." Chief Matthews took the folder, flipping through the pages. His expression grew darker with each passing second. Finally, he looked up, his jaw clenched. "Arrest him," he barked, pointing at John. John's face contorted with rage as the officers moved in, grabbing his arms. "You little bastards," John hissed, his eyes locking onto David and Leo. "This isn't over." But David didn't flinch. For the first time, he felt a weight lift from his chest. They had done it. They had exposed John for who he really was. As the officers dragged his father away, David turned to Leo and Kai, tears streaming down his face. "It's over," he whispered, pulling them into a tight embrace. "We did it." But even as relief washed over him, David couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. John had deep connections, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. But for now, they were safe, and that was enough. As they watched John being taken away, David knew they had won the battle. But the war was far from over. And with the evidence now in the hands of the authorities, all they could do was hope that justice would finally be served. The morning light streamed through the cracked windows of the police station, casting long shadows that seemed to creep toward David, Leo, and Kai as they sat huddled together on a worn bench. The events of the previous night felt like a blur, the adrenaline now replaced with exhaustion and a gnawing sense of dread. They had handed over the folder of evidence, and John was arrested, but David couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over yet. David glanced at Leo, who had his arms wrapped around himself, eyes staring blankly at the floor. The reality of what they'd just done was finally sinking in. They had stood up to their father, exposed him for the monster he truly was, but in doing so, they had torn their family apart. Kai leaned over, gently nudging David's arm. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his eyes filled with concern. David nodded, though his mind was racing. "I don't know, Kai. I want to believe it's over, but I can't help feeling like he's still out there, waiting." Before Kai could respond, the door to the back office opened, and Chief Matthews stepped out. The stern lines on his face were softened slightly as he approached them. "You boys did good last night," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Your father's in custody, and we're working through the evidence. It'll take time, but we'll make sure he faces justice." David felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. Is he still here?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The thought of John being just a few rooms away sent a chill down his spine. The chief nodded. "He's being held in the cells downstairs. We're arranging transport to a secure facility, but we're keeping a close watch. I assure you, he won't be getting out." David wanted to believe him, but the fear in his gut wouldn't go away. John had always been one step ahead, always found a way to control the situation. What if he had another trick up his sleeve? As if on cue, the sound of shouting erupted from the holding cells below. The entire station seemed to tense as officers rushed toward the noise. David's heart leapt into his throat. "What's happening?" Leo asked, his voice trembling. Chief Matthews muttered a curse under his breath. "Stay here," he ordered, before turning and sprinting down the hall, the clamor of chaos growing louder. David exchanged a panicked glance with Kai and Leo. "We can't just sit here," David said. "Something's wrong." Without waiting for a response, David bolted down the hallway, ignoring the shouts of the officers trying to stop him. He had to see for himself. He had to make sure John was still behind bars. Leo and Kai were right behind him, their footsteps echoing off the cold, tiled floors. As they rounded the corner to the holding cells, they skidded to a stop. The scene before them was pure chaos. 2 officers lay on the ground, groaning in pain, while another was wrestling with a tall figure dressed in a black jacket. It was John. No, David breathed, his eyes widening in horror. John had somehow managed to overpower the guards, his eyes wild with rage and desperation. The man who had been so calm, so controlled, was now a beast unleashed. "You think you can take me down?" John roared, shoving the officer away. "You think you've won?" His eyes locked onto David, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "I'm not going down that easily." Before David could react, John grabbed a fallen officer's gun and turned it toward the boys. "Come here, David," John snarled, his voice dripping with menace. "Let's end this, once and for all." David's blood turned to ice, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Dad, put the gun down," he pleaded, taking a cautious step forward. "It's over. The police have everything they need. You can't get away with this." But John just laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "You're just like your mother," he spat. "Always thinking you can outsmart me. But look where it got her." Leo's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "What did you do to Mom?" he screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Tell us." John's expression twisted into something dark and cruel. "She was going to ruin everything," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "She thought she could expose me. I had to stop her." David's heart shattered at the confirmation of what he had always feared. But there was no time to grieve. He had to protect Leo and Kai. He had to put an end to this nightmare. David's eyes flickered to Chief Matthews, who was slowly creeping up behind John, his gun drawn. But John was too quick. He grabbed Leo, pulling him close, the gun pressed to his temple. "One more step, and he's dead," John growled, his eyes wild. David's mind raced. He needed to do something, anything, to distract John. "Dad, listen to me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You don't have to do this. We can still fix this. Just let Leo go." But John shook his head, tightening his grip on Leo. "You ruined everything," he screamed. "You took everything from me." The room was suffocatingly tense, the sound of Leo's panicked sobs filling the air. David's heart broke as he saw the fear in his brother's eyes. He had to act, and fast. In one desperate, reckless move, David lunged forward, grabbing for the gun. The shot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. David stumbled back, his ears ringing, his hands shaking. But as the dust settled, he realized he wasn't hurt. Chief Matthews had tackled John to the ground, wresting the gun from his hands. Leo was safe. David rushed to his brother, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Leo nodded, tears streaming down his face. I thought he was going to kill me," he sobbed. "It's over," David said, more to convince himself than anyone else. "It's finally over." As the officers dragged a handcuffed, snarling John away, David turned to Kai, who stood a few feet away, his eyes wide with shock. "Thank you," David said, his voice breaking. "I couldn't have done this without you." Kai nodded, stepping forward to pull David into a tight hug. "We did it, David. We're free." But even as relief flooded his chest, David knew there would still be scars. The nightmare might be over, but the trauma of what they had endured would stay with them. But they were alive, and together, and that was enough. For now. The morning after John's arrest was like the first breath of air after nearly drowning. For the first time in years, the air in the house felt lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. David opened his eyes to the gentle light filtering through his window and listened to the sound of birds chirping outside. It was a stark contrast to the chaos and fear that had filled their lives for so long. He lay there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. John was gone. The nightmare was finally over. But as he got up and stretched, a dull ache lingered in his chest. They might be free from John's grip, but the damage he had done would take time to heal. David made his way downstairs, surprised to find Leo already awake. His brother was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of untouched coffee, his eyes distant. The past few days had aged him, making him seem older than his 14 years. "Hey," David said softly, pulling out a chair to sit next to him. "How are you holding up?" Leo shrugged, not looking up. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking, maybe this is just a dream. That I'll wake up, and he'll still be here." David reached over and squeezed his brother's hand. "He's gone, Leo," he said gently. "He can't hurt us anymore. We're safe now." Leo's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "But what do we do now, David?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Mom's gone, and Dad." He couldn't finish the sentence, his words breaking into a sob. David's heart broke for his brother. He wished he had all the answers, but he knew it would take time for both of them to figure out how to move forward. "We take it one day at a time," David said softly. "We've got each other, and we'll get through this together." Just then, there was a soft knock on the front door. David glanced at Leo, who gave him a small, hesitant nod. He stood up and walked to the door, opening it to find Kai standing on the porch, holding a box of pastries. "Thought you guys could use a little comfort food," Kai said with a tentative smile. David couldn't help but smile back, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let Kai in. "We were just talking about what's next." Kai placed the box on the table and gave Leo a reassuring pat on the back. "I know things are tough right now," he said. "But you're not alone. You've got each other, and you've got me. We'll figure it out." Leo nodded, a faint smile finally breaking through the sadness on his face. "Thanks, Kai," he whispered. "For everything." The three of them sat around the table, the tension slowly melting away as they shared the pastries. For the first time in a long while, David felt a flicker of hope. They had been through hell, but they had survived. And now, they had a chance to rebuild their lives. As they finished eating, the sound of a car pulling up in front of the house caught their attention. David's stomach clenched with a mix of fear and curiosity, but when he looked out the window, he saw Chief Matthews stepping out of the car. David opened the door as the chief approached, his expression grim but not unkind. "David," Chief Matthews said, nodding in greeting. "I wanted to check on you boys and give you an update." David's heart sank. "Is it about him?" he asked, not daring to say John's name out loud. The chief nodded. "Yes. He's been transferred to a secure facility. He won't be getting out anytime soon," he reassured them. "The evidence you provided was more than enough to keep him locked away." Leo let out a shaky breath, relief washing over his features. "Thank you," he said quietly. Chief Matthews gave them a sympathetic smile. "You boys did a brave thing. It's not easy standing up to someone like him, especially when it's your own father." He paused, his expression softening. "If you ever need anything, help, resources, counseling, don't hesitate to reach out. You're not alone in this." After the chief left, the house felt even quieter, the reality of their new life slowly sinking in. David knew they had a long road ahead, but at least now, they had the freedom to walk it on their own terms. Later that evening, David and Kai took a walk to the park where it had all started, the place where David had first confided in Kai, where they had forged their unlikely alliance. The air was crisp, the sun setting in vibrant shades of orange and pink. "I still can't believe it's over," David said, staring at the swings that creaked in the breeze. Kai reached for David's hand, intertwining their fingers. "You did it, David," he said softly. "You were so strong. You saved your brother, and you got justice for your mom." David looked at Kai, his heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and something else, something deeper that he hadn't fully allowed himself to feel until now. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, squeezing Kai's hand. I'm glad you're here." Kai smiled, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to David's forehead. "I'm not going anywhere," he whispered. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, David felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The darkness that had hung over their family for so long was finally lifting, and now, for the first time, he could see a future where he and Leo could heal, where he could explore whatever this was with Kai. Back at the house, Leo was waiting for them on the porch, a tentative smile on his face. "Hey," he said as they walked up. "I was thinking, maybe we could do something together tomorrow. Like, go to Mom's favorite spot by the lake. Just, to remember her." David's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded, his heart swelling with pride at Leo's strength. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The three of them stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't running, weren't hiding. They were just, together. The shadows of their past would always be there, but they had found a way to step into the light. And as the stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, David knew they were going to be okay. It would take time, but they had each other, and that was enough.